the fundamentals of China's economy are deteriorating. So unfortunately, that just means they're actually getting more aggressive in the short term because they need to use the iron fist of state power to prop up their industries, to forge new markets abroad, and to just carve out a secure buffer for themselves in what Xi Jinping has said himself is what he expects to be stormy seas ahead for China.
What if the new Cold War with China turns hot? Just asking questions. Michael Beckley is here, a political science professor at Tufts, director of the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and fellow at AEI. He's written 2 books about U.S.-China relations, including most recently Danger Zone, the Coming Conflict with China, co-authored with Hal Brands. We want to talk with him about the latest escalation in the trade war with China, rising geopolitical tensions around Taiwan, China's collapsing birth rates and precarious economy, and whether or not it all means the U.S. and China are hurtling towards war. Michael, thank you for coming on the show.
Zach, Liz, it's really good to be with you.
So you open the book Danger Zone with a hypothetical invasion of Taiwan, but in the waning days of the Biden administration. I was wondering if you could update this for our audience now that Trump is in power. What do you think would happen if China were to invade Taiwan tomorrow?
I think the nightmare scenario is that the Chinese determine that the U.S. is going to intervene anyway, and so you might as well hit hard from the get-go. The U.S. only has 2 major military bases within 500 miles of Taiwan. They're both on Okinawa. And so some Chinese military writings talk about doing a Pearl Harbor style strike on those bases and potentially even on Guam, where the U.S. has this giant military base. And so right from the get-go, because of Chinese strategy, because of their need to really cripple the U.S. military so that they can have their way with Taiwan, you'd be, from the opening moments of the conflict, having direct fighting between the United States and China. Now, there's other scenarios. They could just implement a blockade of Taiwan and try to choke it out, cut it off from oil and outside food, which it's almost entirely reliant on. But reading a lot of Chinese military writings, they come to the conclusion that historically those have not really been that decisive. Populations usually will just ride out the pain. And meanwhile, enemies of China, the United States, Japan, other countries may start to counter blockade China, try to cut it off from energy imports. And so it could get very messy. And so the nightmare scenario is just the smash and grab operation where they pulverize those bases on Okinawa. They pulverize Taiwan's offensive military capability. And then they just send droves, hundreds of thousands of troops across the Taiwan Strait in a D-Day style landing.
Well, so I'm curious, do we have a sense of whether the Chinese military has the capacity to not only pulverize those military bases, those US military bases like you're describing, but then also to immediately after that invade Taiwan? Would that be a situation in which they're overextended, or would it in fact be something that's well within their wheelhouse?
It's a great question, Liz. I mean, this would be the double black diamond of military operations. This would be the most complex military operation in modern history because moving a giant army across a body of water is just really difficult. This is why Hitler couldn't invade the UK. The US D-Day landings, that was under the most favorable possible conditions. The Allies controlled the skies for the most part. They were taking on overstretched German forces. Most of the German forces were fighting in the east against the Soviet Union. They were defending foreign territory with mostly small arms and dumb mortars. The Taiwanese they've booby-trapped all of the beaches that you'd be landing on. They have precision-guided munitions and drones and a highly capable Air Force. And then you have, obviously, the United States, which has a lot of firepower there. And the Taiwan Strait itself is one of the roughest bodies of water in the world. You have typhoons, huge waves, storms. So it would be a really complex and difficult operation. On paper, China has the mass, the ships. They're increasingly building these giant barges that can send over hundreds of tanks and heavy vehicles in a single journey. They obviously have the manpower. They have a giant military, and they have the missiles to do a lot of damage. But coordinating this kind of operation where you're trying to preserve control of the skies, protect your ships as they're puttering across the Taiwan Strait, that's an 8-hour journey. It would be incredibly difficult. I don't think they can pull it off, but the risk is that they convince themselves that they can pull it off. And I'm afraid that the US and Taiwan have been very slow to just make it look completely impossible. And as a result, I just worry that, Xi Jinping, people were saying Putin would never invade Ukraine. I just worry these dictators, they don't get the best information. They have big egos, they have sky high ambitions, and in a very unstable international situation, we just have to worry that he might roll the iron dice in the same way that Putin did in Ukraine.
I have one last question, and then I swear to God, I am gonna let Zach speak, because his words are valuable too. But the barges that you mentioned are a personal fixation of mine. I want you to tell our audience a little bit more about what exactly they are. As far as I understand it, I mean, the Chinese military has basically been developing these barges that band together and create this bridge that's able to really stretch across a significant chunk of the Taiwan Strait, which would allow mass transport of basically, ground troops and tanks into Taiwan. I mean, these barges are extremely advanced. We don't really, as far as I know, have anything like them in other parts of the world. And they have these crazy legs that like extend into the seabed that sort of anchor the barges in place. I mean, they're very sophisticated types of things. Is there anything that I'm missing, or can you tell our viewers, what the significance of these barges are?
That was an excellent summary, and I think the key point is that Taiwan is a natural fortress because the East Coast is all these cliffs, so you can't even land there, and then the West Coast, it's mostly these mud flats that extend 2 to 5 miles out, to sea, and they have severe tides, and so if you mess up your timing and you come in, when the tides are out, you're gonna be miles from there, and you have to trudge through the thick wet sand and the mud. And meanwhile, the Taiwanese are turning it into hell on earth. And so the Chinese had to come up with this pretty brilliant workaround to create these barges that unload in sort of a series of bridges, as you've described, and then plant themselves and stabilize themselves and basically just build a quick bridge that they can then roll off various heavy vehicles onto the shores of Taiwan. Again, this is still incredibly difficult to do, even in like a peacetime situation, let alone under fire. But it shows the determination of China and also the geographic difficulties they'd have to overcome in taking on Taiwan.
So, given all those difficulties and the unpredictability of how the Trump administration, in particular, would react, how likely do you actually think such an invasion is, like an imminent invasion?
I usually put it at, just putting a precise number is difficult, but I would say like 10 to 15%. Major power war is a very unlikely event. There's obviously massive costs. The Chinese are well aware of the difficulties that they face. But for me, frankly, 10 to 15% is still way too high. I play a lot of poker, and there's been lots of hands where I've been like a 90% favorite, and then someone hits a card on the river and you lose all your money. So, for me, that's just still way too high of what would be a catastrophic war that would probably become protracted. And obviously, since both the US and China have nuclear weapons, you just have to worry about that kind of escalation. So low probability, but not a trivially low probability.
How how far do you think it is actually for how much in America's interest is it to protect Taiwan? Like, how far would America go, and how far should America go? Like, how much we've got an administration right now that calls itself America First, and so it's orienting itself around the national interests, not in nation building or establishing democracy, or protecting democracy. It's got a more, at least more hard-nosed rhetoric of like, our only military interest is protecting the national interests. So how much in the national interest is it to protect Taiwan from America's perspective?
That's a great question, and I actually wish there was more of a national debate on this. This is something the American people need to decide for themselves, because on the one hand, the risks obviously are massive, and I totally get people that say, I don't want to risk Los Angeles or San Francisco just to save Taipei here. And so I think
Yeah.
we have to have that conversation. The argument for defending Taiwan is, first of all, Chinese expansion doesn't end in Taiwan. It begins there. The Chinese have made very clear it's not just about Taiwan. It's about, they claim most of the East and South China Seas, where roughly half of world trade passes through. They claim an entire Indian province. You've probably been reading about them getting much more coercive there. And we just look at history where great powers generally don't stop expanding until they're confronted by either an enemy army or by just the sheer limits of geography. So it's, if you think that Chinese expansion will just continue until it's stopped, then it's about where do you draw the line. And the ideal is to just nip the problem in the bud and just make it look so impossible to even conquer Taiwan that they don't even try in the first place. And we basically just have to wage a Cold War from there that never goes hot. The geostrategic importance of Taiwan is, as American leaders have said for a long time, it's an unsinkable aircraft carrier at the epicenter of the East and South China Seas, which are themselves the epicenter of where the Pacific and the Indian Oceans meet. This is a critical waterway for dozens of countries, even those outside of East Asia. You also just have the military value of it. This would turn into a launching pad for future Chinese expansion. They've already started talking about how the Ryukyu Islands, which include Okinawa, where the US has its military bases, Xi Jinping has kind of floated the idea that these were actually Chinese territories, and don't really belong to Japan. And so the Japanese, I think quite rightly, assume that if China takes Taiwan, the next route would be those Ryukyu island chains. There's also, people mention the computer chips and Taiwan's economic importance. There'd be a massive economic hit if there's a war over Taiwan. And if China can just immaculately absorb Taiwan, then it suddenly is in control of the only fab that can make the high-end computer chips that are making our conversation right here possible. And then I think finally, it's really much more about the international order. I think we've all just been very lucky to be living. I mean, there's obviously wars going on, et cetera, but compared to our ancestors, like pre 1945, the
Uh-huh.
rate of warfare, the number of people killed, that had a lot to do with the fact that there was no sort of open commercial system that countries large and small could just plug and play with. It was like might makes right, and everyone has to defend their supply chains and militarize and to heavily defend their borders. And as a result, you just get war after war after war. If you're going to have an order, then you have to preserve that order, and this would be a key point there. And the fact that Taiwan also is a democracy and would be crushed by the Chinese Communist Party would just make it very hard to convince other fledgling democracies that they should stand up for their way of life as opposed to just succumbing under the boot of autocratic aggressors like Russia, North Korea, China, etc. So there's a whole range of interests here. There's also the US allied credibility interests, like who's going to take the US seriously if after passing a law, the Taiwan Relations Act, it is American law that the United States has to maintain its own capacity to be ready to defend Taiwan, that the US has to supply Taiwan with defensive military equipment, and that the United States has an interest in the peaceful resolution of the Taiwan situation. If the US just doesn't do anything and doesn't lift a finger, I don't know how anyone could take US security guarantees seriously, and that whole order just basically disintegrates. So that's the case for it. But I also get the idea that, compared to a potential nuclear war with China, maybe we sacrifice some of these things. But I just think the conversation needs to happen. So I appreciate you all bringing it up.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like the issue of imperialism has sort of been dormant for quite a while. And now, between some of the noises that President Trump is making in the direction of, for example, Greenland, as well as oddly Canada, and then at times the Panama, um, as well as people more seriously considering the prospect of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, it's like this issue is just becoming a lot more live, a lot hotter, and something that really does need to be part of our political discourse to a greater degree than ever before. I'm not saying that Xi Jinping's quest to take Taiwan and President Trump's quest to possibly take Greenland or to make a deal with Denmark is in any way equivalent, but I'm just saying that we're seeing this lots of world leaders turn toward territorial expansion in a way that we really haven't in quite a while. I want to bring us to the thing that's on everybody's minds right now, which is the fact that Trump has launched a trade war with China. There's basically been this Trump attempt to levy tariffs on China, and then Xi Jinping has responded in kind. There's been a ratcheting up back and forth now. The maximum threatened tariff appears to be 145%. This has only gone into effect on some specific sectors. And then we see the massive categories that people were really fearing now being exempted. For example, electronics, laptops, and iPhones, and semiconductors, and all these things. But the Trump administration is saying, those tariffs are just paused for now, but actually the final amounts will be rolled out within the next month or two. So right now, the patchwork is really frustrating for companies, both American and Chinese, to be navigating. It's very difficult for consumers to predict how this is going to affect their bottom line. One of the really interesting facets of all of this is that the Trump administration, when announcing the list of which countries they're imposing tariffs on and what amounts, they sort of made an admission that Taiwan is something that is a place that they consider to be a country, which kind of pissed off the CCP naturally. But all of this, I think, amounts to a for a long time, there had been this really intense and important economic relationship between the US and China. Now Trump appears to have sort of, crumpled it up and thrown it in the trash heap. Does this make the prospect of actual war much more likely with China?
Yeah, I think it's a complex causal chain because I think these trade wars are partially a symptom of a deeper geopolitical rivalry, and we've seen this throughout history that when you have two great powers competing, economics turns from an area of peace and cooperation, let's all get rich together, to an arena of conflict because they start to worry about their vulnerabilities. Hey, we depend on them for medical PPE and rare earths and run-of-the-mill computer chips, et cetera. Like that's dangerous. And they start to freak out about their dependence on us. And so then you tend to get these great powers pursuing self-reliance by trying to wall themselves off or trying to gain commercial advantage by subsidizing their industries or slapping tariffs on their rival, and it escalates and then fuels back into that initial geopolitical rivalry. And I think you're seeing that with China and the United States today, in the same way that Britain and Germany prior to World War One waged a fierce commercial rivalry before they ended up coming to blows in that conflict. World War II, as you well know, is presaged by a giant Smoot-Hawley leveraged trade war and economic depression. So I think the core is the geopolitical rivalry, but then that causes trade wars to erupt, which then fuels the hostility and makes the geopolitical rivalry even more intense. So unfortunately, that's just where we're at right now, and this is why um, I've always been of the opinion that these tariffs and investment restrictions between the U.S. and China are going to get much worse before there's any possibility of them getting better. The only thing I was really shocked to see from the Trump administration was just, again, the slapping tariffs across the board, across allies and adversaries alike. A lot of people were counseling, hey, maybe get your allies together, sort out your trade stuff, and then do collective bargaining with the Chinese from a position of strength and multinational support. But the actual tariffs on China, when people were saying, "Oh, maybe it'll just be 10%," I thought 60% was the floor. Now we've already blown way past that, and I think it's probably gonna get even worse.
What do you make of the MAGA rights argument that in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, actually what President Trump is doing now, which is not only forcing some supply chain sturdiness, we've already seen in the years preceding and actually under the Biden administration, more focus on semiconductor chip manufacturing being reshored and being brought to the United States versus having to rely on Taiwan for absolutely everything. We've already seen this sort of underway. But now a big argument that a lot of parts of the right will make is actually Trump's tariffs on China are a very good and important thing because it is important for American industrial capacity to be strengthened in advance of whatever the hell China does over the next few years with regard to Taiwan. Do you make much of this argument? Is this in fact, foreign policy 4D chess on the part of the Trump administration, or is this argument missing something important?
I think what it misses is they've dialed up the economic hostility towards China, made it very blatant. We're just going to slap you with tariffs. We're going to dial up the investment restrictions. We're going to combine that with a lot of tough talk, just to show how hostile we are. Before we've actually rebuilt our industrial base, and in particular our defense industrial base, you could have gone about it in a different way, namely investing at home. I actually think things like the CHIPS Act, some of the infrastructure investments made under the Biden administration were starting to pay dividends. You actually saw more and more factories opening in the US, some limited reshoring coming back. And so you could have accentuated that before you actually move to the economic restrictions, because I'm actually quite confident in the US long run ability to compete with China. I think the US actually is still dominating many key industries and has a lot of leverage there. But the problem is our ability to churn stuff out is very limited, especially if there's a major conflict like a protracted war. Our manufacturing capability, our shipbuilding capability, our ability to produce drones or source rare earths. We need time to develop all of that. So I would have rather have seen more domestic investment, stay away from the economic hostility. And then once you've built up that big stick, then if you need to turn the screws on the Chinese, then you can come out with the economic hostility. Where we're leading with the hostility before we're really prepared for a fight that we may not be ready to win right now.
We're gonna have to headline this AEI fellow defends Biden administration. No, not actually. We won't throw you under the bus.
I'm from Berkeley, California. I'm a liberal, tree hugging hippie freak at heart, so you shouldn't be surprised by it.
Your true colors are showing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about the way that these tariffs were applied, you're describing it as the classic big stick. It feels very unsubtle in that way that perhaps they're even for a free trading loving libertarian like myself, I can see the rationale for, okay, maybe we don't want to import and build our telecommunications infrastructure with Chinese technology that can then be later used to surveil us. Like, that's a security issue. But then, you could make some of these arguments for trying to bolster US manufacturing of certain critical components, but sort of tying it all up in this big basket of tariffs across the board that are affecting both Chinese companies that don't have anything to do with harming our security, and then American companies that need Chinese inputs to build the manufacturing that we want to have in order to gain some more independence in certain sectors. Like, is there a more targeted way that this could be done, that would achieve the security objectives, but without kind of the economic downsides?
I mean, I think the best is the domestic investment, but that's also not foolproof because if China is
Yeah.
able to dump into your market, and if they're able to round trip, so even if you put tariffs on China and they're just coming in through Mexico or setting up factories there and posing as a Mexican company or a Canadian company or a Japanese company, then I get the Trump administration's argument that this allows them to infiltrate and essentially loot the system for mercantilist gain. And so you have to have some kind of protection. I just think you could have set, the 10% across the board tariff to try to cut down on some of the round tripping. You could have imposed tariffs and investment restrictions in targeted areas, the crown jewels, basically. And what's easy is like both the Chinese and the Americans list all of the strategic industries that they really care about. And so, like, from an investment standpoint, it's very easy to know what the ones are that they are going to really be prioritizing. So you focus on those and try to isolate those supply chains, and then everything else, I think you can have a relatively light hand on because they don't have that strategic significance. I think that would have been the way to go, and then you can always ratchet up later on. But the way that we're going right now is just like flood the zone and sort of a full frontal
Yeah.
Smoot Hawley level tariffs on everyone, and sort of every nation for itself at this point.
And then in terms of if there was a confrontation, I want to play this clip from October 2021 from General Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He told Bloomberg that China had developed hypersonic missiles. Let's play that clip because I think it illuminates what's sort of, where are the pieces on the chessboard at the moment. Could you roll that, John?
As we talk today, there have recently been some reports that the Chinese have a hypersonic missile
Yeah.
that can theoretically go into space and then come down with a nuclear bomb, escaping our ability to knock it down. Is that something I should be worried about, or all Americans should be worried about?
It is very concerning. I think I saw in some of the newspapers they used the term Sputnik moment. I don't know if it's quite a Sputnik moment, but I think it's very close to that. So it's a very significant technological event that occurred, or test that occurred by the Chinese, and it has all of our attention, and we're paying it. But that's just one weapon system. The Chinese military capabilities are much greater than that. They're expanding rapidly in space, in cyber, and then in the traditional domains of land, sea, and air. And they have gone from a peasant-based infantry army that was very, very large in 1979 to a very capable military that covers all the domains and has global ambition.
Okay. So saying maybe sort of a Sputnik moment, not quite. And we should note it's important when we're hearing statements like this coming from someone out of the Pentagon that they might have their own incentives to inflate threats. So I don't know exactly what to make of all that, which is why I want to ask you about it. Like, where does China's military tech stand from your understanding, and how does that change the political and military calculations in terms of how America deals with it?
I think, first of all, you don't have to just listen to the Pentagon. You can literally see the Chinese ships and combat aircraft and the full-scale mock-ups of American aircraft carriers and Taiwanese bases they built out in the desert and that they're doing practice bombing runs on, to get a sense that the Chinese are extremely serious about
Hmm.
creating these vast military capabilities. They are producing combat aircraft, warships, and ammunition at 5 to 6 times the American rate right now, and you can just literally see that from satellite photos that you can find on the internet. I think what General Milley has focused on there is really important to understand, because the Chinese have developed a new suite of options to hit the American homeland in various ways, because the Chinese have looked at past American wars and they've said these Americans, they always have the luxury of having a secure homeland, like very few civilian casualties, their infrastructure stays intact, and they just eventually bury their opponents by out manufacturing them over time. So even if they kind of stumble into the conflict initially, they can make up for it just by sheer mass. We need to deny them that ability. So they developed these hypersonic missiles that there's no way our missile defense systems can shoot them down, so they can credibly threaten to deliver nuclear warheads to our homeland. But they've also seeded a lot of cyber weapons into our critical infrastructure. The FBI, the NSA, the CIA have all recently testified openly, kind of leaking some of the bottom lines of their intelligence assessments, because they just realize how important it is for Americans to understand this threat. They've also come up with obviously cyber operations that can just paralyze a lot of our transportation. And so just understanding that the US is probably not going to have a sanctuary if there is a conflict, I think just makes it all the more important to avoid this, because it could get very messy very quickly. And again, I think it comes back to deterrence in the Taiwan Strait first and foremost.
Yeah, but isn't just mutually assured destruction still a deterrent? Is that not still in play in terms of restraining any sort of use of like a nuclear strike on the U.S. homeland?
Yeah, so a nuclear strike, that's hopefully way up the escalation ladder. But I think that's also why the Chinese have developed these lower level, lower impact
Right.
strategic weapons like the cyber weapons, so they can shut off our water or electricity and just make life a lot worse for us. So that if there's a blockade scenario or we're still in a limited war scenario, they can say, look, we're just going to keep dialing up the pressure over time. And that, the threshold for use of those is much, much lower. And also I just worry, because I look at the past history of great power conflict, and they usually go in assuming it's going to be this short little splendid war and we're just going to be home by Christmas. But as both sides take casualties and rage just builds on both sides, they look for all types of ways to hurt each other in the worst ways possible. I mean, the allied bombings of German and Japanese cities, and eventually the use of nuclear weapons. I mean, you see it even with Israel and Hamas today. I mean, once wars start, they build a logic of their own, and I worry that the threshold for using even something like a battlefield nuclear weapon against a major American base, for example, I think that starts to go down very quickly if it turns out that this is just a massive war for primacy in East Asia and potentially for the future of both of these great powers going forward.
Yeah, another sort of relevant example is how protracted the conflict in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine has become. I mean, we're many years into that at this point. I want to sort of go back to basics for a second, if you'll humor me, and ask what almost seems like a stupid question, except I would rather just ask the basic stupid question if it is, in fact, the one that tons of normal Americans are thinking. How strong is China really?
That's a fantastic question, because on paper, it looks incredibly strong. The top manufacturing country in the world, the top trade partner of the majority of the world's countries, the largest navy in the world by number of ships, the most diversified conventional missile arsenal. They have missiles of all different ranges, because the US and Russia signed this arms control agreement so that they couldn't build intermediate range missiles. The Chinese never signed that. And so they built all these missiles that can hit every target around East Asia. And obviously, they just have sheer mass on their side and a brutal authoritarian regime that, if Xi Jinping loses 400,000 guys going across the Taiwan Strait in the first round, I have no doubt in my mind he would be willing to send a second wave or a third wave after that. So at least on paper, it's very strong. However, it hasn't been battle tested. China hasn't fought a major war since 1979 when it invaded Vietnam, and that didn't go well at all. They basically went to Vietnam, got hammered, and then pulled back and declared victory that they taught the Vietnamese a lesson. there's been widespread, there's lots of research documenting the extreme corruption in China's military. And I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing so many high level military officers, including the second in command, get purged and basically be disappeared over time. Because, this is just a problem for authoritarian regimes, is that you always have to worry that the guns surrounding you could be turned on you. And so you have to purge and purge and purge, root it out. You have to pay off your cronies through corrupt deals while at the same time purging your potential rivals. That just doesn't work well for military effectiveness. They also have the old Soviet model where every unit has both a military officer, but also a political commissar that's there to make sure that everyone stays loyal. And so you have to spend all your time in these political meetings. So there's just all of these inefficiencies and corruptions within the PLA. And again, I think the most important point is that what China is trying to do, either conquer Taiwan or somehow take over the East or South China Seas, these are the hardest missions in warfare, especially in an age where we have drones and accurate missiles that can basically destroy massed targets of the kind that China would need to assemble a big invasion fleet or a big blockade fleet. That's just something the Chinese, no matter how good they are, can't overcome. And I think that's why the United States and Taiwan and the rest of the allies have a chance to really exploit that military asymmetry, even though China obviously has built up this massive military machine.
One thing I think about a lot because I've done some reporting on Hong Kong, and Zach traveled to Hong Kong to cover the protests as they were happening when the national security law was taking effect, is like China essentially seized Hong Kong. They had a little bit more sort of like legal grounding in that the terms of the handover and transitioning control of Hong Kong back to China was always going to happen. It's that they did it on an expedited timeline, significantly expedited timeline. But it's almost like China found a way to erode and winnow away at the sort of civil liberties and the political system that was very democratic and highly functional in Hong Kong without having to use much military might at all. They were able to um, sort of be a little bit more sneaky about that. Is the Hong Kong case a sort of red herring totally irrelevant to this entire conversation that we're having here? Or is Hong Kong actually sort of like an interesting, like, should it be looked at as a test case for how China can sort of engage in this territorial expansion and seize a democracy and exert more control? Or are the actual facts on the ground that are present in Hong Kong and with the unique structure of Hong Kong's governance just totally different than what's going on in Taiwan?
I think it's both. On the one hand, it's an important canary in the coal mine, so to speak, for showing China's intentions, so that
Okay.
when it does take control of an area, it doesn't just leave it open for the rest of the world to access. It doesn't try to spread peace and prosperity. They bring their boots on the ground, and it becomes a domain of coercion and repression. You're obviously seeing the same thing in Xinjiang with the concentration camps, in Tibet, where martial law has basically been employed, and in the South China Sea, where the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times have done these amazing heat maps where they just show the maritime militia and Chinese naval vessels getting like their transits are getting thicker and thicker and thicker in the South China Sea, and they're building these artificial islands to take it over. So I think it shows China's intentions. But you're right that the geographic situation, the political situation is very different than in Taiwan, because Hong Kong is basically attached or close to the mainland, and is part of sort of mainland China. There's no military solution for allies to protect Hong Kong's freedoms at the end of the day. Taiwan is this island fortress with 23 million people and a huge military ready to do battle, and then potentially US intervention as well. So I think it shows you China's intentions, that they are very serious, and that if they have an ability, they were supposed to lay off of Taiwan's freedoms till 2047. Well, here we are in 2025, and Hong Kong has basically been crushed and turned into just another Chinese mainland city. But it doesn't mean that they can then apply that to Taiwan, because they don't have physical control over it, and it's just really hard to get that physical control.
I want to add context just in case any of our viewers or listeners are confused, because it occurs to me that all three of us have a little bit of background on Hong Kong, but not every layperson might. Hong Kong was basically a British colony up from, I believe, like 1841 up until 1997 when, the handover was orchestrated and it was sort of handed back to China, but allowed to maintain its sort of semi-independent status for a term of 50 years. And so the scheduled sort of like collapsing of Hong Kong back into China was supposed to happen, as you noted, in 2047. And basically over the course of Zach, when was the national security law first passed? 2018 or 2019?
think it was 2018 and the protests
2018.
started in 2019. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically the national security law, which was an attempt to kind of replace a lot of Hong Kong's legislature, which Hong Kong's legislature already had a bunch of pro CCP, sort of pro business, pro corporate contingents within it. But this essentially really stacked the deck in favor of the CCP and sort of eroded the free and fair elections that Hong Kong had come to expect, while also basically allowing the police to crack down on people who began to protest in the streets. And we saw massive protests in Hong Kong over the course of 2019 and the first part of 2020. And then COVID was very much used as a pretense to crack down on people's civil liberties further. And, now lots of businesses still operate in Hong Kong. Lots of people still go to Hong Kong to go to school. But the academic freedom, the political freedoms, the ability to protest, the ability to actually hold free and fair elections with politicians who are openly critical of mainland China has really come to a pretty screeching halt. I think if you visit Hong Kong today, which I have not, it would probably feel rather different. Like in some ways, it would maybe feel the same and look like it's still highly functioning. But this little bit of this unique political arrangement and a very democratic system has really, I mean, it will never again, at least in our lifetime, seemingly come back. And that's a really awful and terrifying thing to consider.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's such a great summary. Go ahead, Zach.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, all that we've laid out here so far makes it seem that like China is this ascendant, rising power, expansionist power. But I want to be clear that the thesis of your book is actually that China is not ascendant, that China is, in a sense, peaking. In fact, we've been told for many years with books like these I'm displaying that China's about to take over the world. We're about to become China's bitch. This last one by Trump advisor Peter Navarro, "Death by China." Um, you say that there's that story is actually not quite right. Could you explain why?
Yeah, it's incomplete. China is obviously making big moves, major investments in key technologies, a massive manufacturing subsidized system, and a huge military. But its economy has been slowing precipitously over the last 15 years or so. And not just the economic growth rate, which Beijing, frankly, sort of makes up. I would encourage listeners to whatever Beijing says they're growing at, like they just said they're growing at 5.4% or something like that. I would at least cut that in half, if not more. But the broader point is that the China's economic model is running out of steam. That model is built on basically having the Chinese people put their life savings in banks where they're not really paid much of any interest. And then the Chinese government uses that to subsidize the mass production of manufactured goods, of infrastructure, and just build and build and build. That authoritarian model works really well at the lower levels of development. It works well when you have a growing population, so that if you build lots of apartment buildings, you're always going to have demand and people moving into them. But now China, basically all of the tailwinds that propelled its rapid growth are turning into headwinds, dragging it down. So its population, instead of having this huge demographic dividend where you had 15 workers to support every retiree, that's collapsing to 2 workers to support every retiree. By next decade, the population itself is going to collapse in half sometime this century. You have the Chinese government encountering greater pushback on the international scene, so it can't access foreign markets as easily, at least in the West. And that's why it has to do something like the Belt and Road Initiative to try to open up new markets in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, and Central Asia. You have China running out of resources, so it's now the top food and energy importer in the world, and that raises the price of just producing stuff at home. And so you've just seen production costs go way up in China. You've seen productivity be negative productivity growth every year for about the last decade or so. And then rising debt because you have diminishing returns in the economy. At a certain point, you've built the high-speed rail, you've built the roads, and so building another one doesn't make a lot of sense. There's no one moving into these apartment complexes that are being built, so they're bulldozing a lot of them. And so you just run out of stuff to produce, and you're just not growing as fast. And I don't see that changing anytime soon because the fundamentals of China's economy are deteriorating. So unfortunately, that
Yeah.
just means they're actually getting more aggressive in the short term because they need to use the iron fist of state power to prop up their industries, to forge new markets abroad, and to just carve out a secure buffer for themselves in what Xi Jinping has said himself is what he expects to be stormy seas ahead for China.
Yeah, and one of the most visible symbols of what you're talking about are these so-called ghost cities. You talked about them, some of them being bulldozed now. I'm pulling up one right now called a picture of one called Chenggong that was apparently in 2012 completely almost completely vacant, all these buildings. It's hard to find data as to like where things are with this now. I assume given the lack of population growth that it has not improved much. But like, um, how does something like this happen? Is this, is this just a classic failure of central planning, a failure to forecast and pay attention to what the actual demographics are, or is there some sort of financial incentive to build these things? Why are there things like ghost cities or rail lines that go nowhere and run up tons of debt? What about the Chinese system explains phenomena like that?
It's, if you are a Leninist one party state and you want to maintain your monopoly on power forever, you never want to give up that power, and you want to be a great nation, in fact, the most powerful nation on earth, your two biggest worries are your own people and you worry about foreign rivals. So, how do we advance and grow our economy while not giving our people too much freedom and too much private wealth, which can become private power and turned against the regime? And how do we not get folded into these Western supply chains and basically become a cog in a Western machine, just assembling iPhones, et cetera? We need to develop our own technology. Well, that means you have to do what Lenin counseled, which is the state retains control over what he called the commanding heights of the economy. So the banking system, you control the money. You control the major heavy industries that enable all the others. So only you can build the roads because no one else can get access to that. And you also just maintain a vast patronage system where big companies that stay loyal to the regime get subsidies, and private companies that run their mouth a little too much or try to carve out their own fiefdom or don't abide by the regulations just get snuffed out. And it also means you have to have the Chinese people have very few options with what to do with their money. I mean, basically, if you're a Chinese citizen, you can put it in a state-owned bank, which is what most people do. You can invest in real estate, but obviously with a declining population, that's not a great investment. Or you can play around on the Chinese stock market, but most people think that's basically rigged in favor of elites. So most people just put it into the state-owned banks, and this is why the Chinese government is rich, even though the Chinese people, if you look at their disposable income, it's a fraction of what the per capita GDP is. I mean, there's an entire, I think one of the best books written on China is called Invisible China by Scott Rozelle and Natalie Hell at Stanford. And they go into the countryside where hundreds of millions of people live. They have less than a middle school education. They have worms in their stomach. They're incredibly impoverished. They live on $10 or less a day. So they keep them artificially poor. They control the money, and it's just basically a giant patronage system. And then you channel it to big state-owned companies that build ghost cities, build whatever. They don't care if it generates value because they're getting paid. They get the contracts. And then if you have to tear it down, well, so what? Then you just move on to the next thing because you have this bottomless source of savings from the Chinese people who have to basically put their money into the state-owned banks. And this, as an authoritarian regime, also allows you to build up your technology so that you compete with the Americans. You don't have to have private entrepreneurs innovating in all these disruptive ways. You use top-down state planning, 5-year plans, very Soviet style, kind of, we're just going to throw money and smart people at these problems. They're all dependent on the regime. That just makes a lot of sense if your primary objective is to maintain your monopoly on power at home.
I'm interested in this question of demographic collapse. I know you've received a little bit of criticism for the book based off of, some people's perception that the book is over reliant on this sort of demographics as destiny type argument. But I tend to be somebody who's pretty concerned about the birth rate in the West. Zach had a slide pulled up a second ago of the current fertility rate in China, which is about 1.2 births per woman, which is extraordinarily low. I mean, the population growth, it's negative population growth these days.
Just turned
A
negative. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this clearly has to do with the fact that, sort of on the tail of the Ehrlich population bomb hysteria that gripped the world, back a few decades ago, China very much implemented a one-child policy, and then very recently, actually, has reversed that and attempted to try to get couples to have, 2 kids, 3 kids. Now they also have a huge population problem where since the one-child policy was in place for so long, there's an imbalance between genders because if you can only have one child, then parents would be very clear about preferring to have a boy over a girl. And so now you have a problem where you have tons more eligible bachelors than you have women. And, how are people supposed to couple up under such conditions? Could you explain what exactly does this portend for China's future as a global superpower?
So demographics is not destiny, but it matters an incredible amount. So the World Bank did a number of studies about a decade ago, and they calculated that roughly 80% of the wealth in a developed economy is in human capital. The stuff, the desks, the computers, the physical things, they matter, but they're not nearly as important as the capabilities, the labor of the population. You need it obviously not just to have workers to produce stuff, but you need it for your fiscal tax base. So if you have a lot of seniors, you're just draining and falling further into debt. You also need it for consumption, and this is, I think, one of China's biggest problems. China is extremely good at production, at producing mass volume of manufactured goods, but the problem is consumption is incredibly low. Again, because the Chinese people are relatively poor and they live in an insecure environment where, if I'm going to set up a business, how do I know that the state's not just going to take it away from me one day, or that the dictator will decide they're going to lock me in my apartment for months on end because they just decide we don't want any COVID cases or whatever. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. And so consumption is abysmally low in China. And with a shrinking population, it's only going to get worse. And look, demography, again, is not destiny, but when you're talking about a radical shift as what China is about to go through, just in the next 10 years, losing 70 million working age adults while gaining 130 million senior citizens, that's like taking an entire France of workers and taxpayers and consumers out of the economy, adding an entire Japan of elderly senior citizens in 10 years. I, you can have all the productivity improvements you want. It's just not going to be enough to compensate for that massive shortfall of what economists have shown is the key source of long-term economic development.
Can you explain for our viewers in like a minute or less what exactly went down with the one child policy?
Yeah, so in the 50s and 60s, there was a big baby boom because Mao Zedong wanted to turn China into a superpower. China had been decimated by decades of World War II and the Japanese brutality there, but also the Chinese Civil War. And so he encouraged the Chinese people to have lots of children, and they obliged, and the population exploded by about 80% in 30 years. But if you look, I would encourage your listeners to look at a topographical map of China, because even though China's landmass is about the size of the continental US, most of it is high, like the Himalayas or desert, basically. And you can see that there's only this tiny little chunk that's by the coastline that has arable land and enough water and is just, you can build transport over it. And so that's where the Han Chinese have concentrated. And so the problem is there was massive overcrowding. You're in a poor country. And so the Chinese government, and I think probably influenced by Ehrlich and that whole population boom scare, implemented this draconian policy. And they reaped massive benefits. I mean, demographers estimate that at least 25% of China's rapid growth over the last 30 to 40 years was just because you had these people, these baby boomers, coming into the prime of their working lives with relatively few children to take care of and relatively few elderly parents to take care of. But now they're paying the cost and flipping back on it. And so that's why you've seen the regime first move to a 2-child policy and now to a 3-child policy. And now they're just trying to do whatever they can pronatally, paying people. They're also re-upping these kind of old school, women's place in society, this more sort of chauvinistic view of how families should be run. I mean, they're trying basically everything to boost this. I think they also realize they're just going to have to turn to automation in the long run. But the problem is robots don't buy things, and so it doesn't solve their consumption problem. So it came out of a lot of that fear and the fact that China doesn't have a lot of resources relative to its population, but obviously it was taken way to the extremes. And I don't see very few countries I've seen have been able to reverse this fertility decline once it starts, because people just are deciding not to have children at this point.
But can't Xi Jinping just kind of pull a Mao and find a way to get the population to explode through, whether it's intense campaign, sort of propaganda campaign, or extreme incentives? I mean, it's an authoritarian state, and we've seen Mao successfully pull this off in the past. Is there any hope, I guess, from Xi Jinping's perspective, that he could do the same type of thing?
So Mao did it when China was 90% peasants, I want to say. It's like
Mhm.
yeah, and when you're a peasant, children are free labor on the farm. So it makes a lot of sense. But now that China is highly urbanized, and just given the state of technology and just how expensive it is in China to raise children, in a lot of Chinese cities, you have to pay for high school. So it's not even just the college, but you have to pay once you get into high school. So it's massive expense. Housing is very expensive. So I think what you're seeing in just a lot of economies around the world, people are not willing to do that. And especially women, they're like, I don't want to tie myself down. I have my career going on here. Like, why would I want to be at home, dealing with the kids? And if this guy is not going to step up and do his part, then certainly I'm not going to do that. So I just think they're trying everything, unless they somehow like literally force the Chinese citizens to breed and produce children. I don't see how they're going to possibly solve this problem.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I relate to that. I would never have a baby just to make Xi Jinping happy. I would
Yeah.
have babies because I, think they're good and important, but yeah, I totally relate to that, actually.
Yeah.
Well, I was hoping you could help us understand a little bit better what it is Xi Jinping wants for China. So, if we sort of trace the history from Mao forward, we had the the just complete bloodbath of Maoism, and then there was a period of what seemed like liberalization, the China miracle, as Deng Xiaoping tried to uh, embrace markets to some degree, and uh, you know, liberals and libertarians at that time were like, China is going to embrace markets, and then political freedom is going to follow. That didn't quite work out how everyone was hoping it was going to work out. Um,
Don't be
Xi
subtweeting
Jinping.
Milton Friedman right now, Zach.
Yeah, well, he had high hopes, and it was understandable. But what I think that the ascendancy of Xi Jinping to power really seems to have brought China into a totally different era, and it helps to understand an adversary's motives if we want to avoid war. And your book does a great job of laying that out. So every year he gives an address to the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, of which he's the head. And according to you, this 2017 address was particularly important because it lays out his grand vision and kind of enshrines Xi Jinping thought into the Constitution. Here, just to give you a taste of this presentation, which is named To Secure a Decisive Victory in Building a Moderately Prosperous Society in All Respects and Strive for the Great Success of Socialism with Chinese Characteristics for a New Era. The theme of this Congress is to remain true to our original aspiration and keep our mission firmly in mind, hold high the banner of socialism with Chinese characteristics, secure a decisive victory in building a moderately prosperous society in all respects, strive for the great success of socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, and work tirelessly to realize the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. So, um, what is Xi Jinping thought is best you can encapsulate it?
You can boil it down to two things. One, keep the Communist Party in power forever in China, and two, make China a globally dominant nation. And this is what every Chinese leader has wanted to do. It's just that Xi Jinping, he's coming to power in a particular moment, a moment when China has stood back up and gained a number of capabilities it didn't have 30 years ago, but also at a moment where now the economy is slowing. The previous model of joining Western supply chains, pumping up your manufacturing industries, and then selling into markets and selling to these crazy Americans that'll just buy anything. That's no longer really working. And now with the population declining too, you can't count on future Chinese demand to replace those foreign markets and become more self-reliant. So you got to really muscle up and get ready for a period of extreme competition. I mean, I think I would encourage your listeners to read Frank DeCotter's work. He's at Stanford because he got into a lot of the archives, or Rush Doshi's work. He's at Georgetown. They've found all these internal speeches that Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping, all these previous leaders that we thought were sort of technocrats and evolving towards a more market-oriented form of authoritarianism. Behind closed doors, Jiang Zemin literally said to his comrades, "Look, we're going to join the WTO, but we're not going to abide by these things. I mean, this is just a way for us to build up our power over time." They're doing what Lenin did in the 20s under the so-called new economic policy, where you tolerate some markets, some foreign investment as a way to enrich the regime, but it's always with the long-term goal of eventually becoming self-reliant again and then powerful on the international stage. And so I think, Xi Jinping obviously is a very ambitious leader. He obviously matters, but I think it would be a mistake to assume that he has different priorities than the previous ones. All these previous Chinese leaders have made the same territorial claims, for example, that Xi Jinping has. Taiwan has to be brought into the mainland. The East and South China Seas, that's basically a Chinese lake. These huge chunks of India, these Austria-sized chunks of India, that's part of China. And it's all a way of making up for that century of humiliation when this great multi-thousand year civilization in China is brought to its knees by the Japanese and by Western powers and by internal conflict in China. The Chinese Communist Party said that will never happen again. We will never be internally divided. We're going to enforce uniformity. They have one time zone, for example. I mean, just in so many ways, they enforce uniformity at home. And we're never going to be bullied by foreign rivals ever again. And if you're going to do that, then, a lot of his policies, which don't make sense from like a hedge fund analyst position, make a lot of sense if you're a dictator of a country trying to revive a nationalist dream of elevating China on the international stage while retaining your iron grip on power at home.
People describe the Chinese political system in a ton of different ways, communist or fascist or sort of state capitalist. The CCP refers to itself as basically socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. How exactly should we consider China's economy?
I just consider it fascist, basically, but that's because I don't think people assume there's this huge difference between fascist powers and communist powers, but a lot of the same elements go into it. So you have everything centers around a central leader. So you have that cult of personality, which, as you've pointed out, he's literally written himself into the Constitution. If you listen to the propaganda, he's at the third part of this holy trinity. Under Mao, China stands up. Under Deng, China grows rich, and under Xi Jinping, China is going to become mighty again. So you have the cult of personality. You have the worship of military power. If you just watch the Chinese military parades, you get a good sense of that. You also have a corporatist structure. So you have tight relations between that one party state and the major corporations. Again, Lenin, the commanding heights of the economy. You also saw that in the fascist regimes, which had these tight links between industry and the central government. And then you also have a crackdown on minorities at home because it's all about unity, national unity. We all have to sacrifice for the nation. All these differences we have amongst ourselves have to be boiled down or just eliminated. And so I think just like you saw persecution of ethnic minorities in, say, I don't know, Nazi Germany, what's happening to the Uyghurs right now, the Tibetans, they're obviously not being slaughtered en masse, but they are being repressed in ways that I think are very consistent with just a fascist idea of we're all one nation. We celebrate that nation. That nation is militarily strong, and we're going to unite, and in particular behind a dear leader that will take us into the promised land. This rejuvenation, reconquering our past glory, recapturing our past glory. This all seems very fascist to me.
I've been paying attention to what's been going on in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, and I've been paying attention to what was going on with Hong Kong probably since 2018 or so. Zach and I, both sort of independently of one another, back in January of 2020, I think were fascinated by the sort of spread of COVID in China, long before it had reached American shores and became an issue that Americans were actually talking about and caring about. I feel like there's been this thing happening, and I want you to tell me whether this is real or not, where it's like China's been highly assertive maybe within the last 10 years to perhaps a greater degree than before. I'm not going to say that they were dormant before, but it's like surveilling the Uyghurs and repressing them has become a greater priority, and seizure of Hong Kong and preparing to be able to take Taiwan. It feels like they're in this mode of just making some major moves in all of these directions. Is this in my head? Is this like entirely a situation where like I just started paying attention and caring about China and so it feels like a recent phenomenon when in reality it was going on all along? Or is there actually a sort of marked shift in the assertiveness with which China's been doing this type of thing?
Yeah, I no, it's definitely not in your head, and you can document it with data. A lot of my academic research and many others have been trying to document this clear shift. Some people thought it was about Xi Jinping, but I'm actually convinced that it starts in the last couple years of the Hu Jintao administration. I personally think a lot of it has to do with the 2008 financial crisis as a major turning point because basically that was potentially devastating to China because they're very dependent on exports to Western markets that are all seizing up and no longer able to buy stuff because they're in a financial crisis. So the Chinese react to that with this massive stimulus set of, they've been rolling out an Obama-sized stimulus package basically every 6 months since the 2008 financial crisis. So just pumping tons of money in there.
Crazy.
Then they realize they don't have anyone to sell to. And so then they're like, well, we need to like what becomes the Belt and Road Initiative. It starts in the last 2 years under Hu Jintao. I can't remember exactly what they called it, but it eventually becomes the Belt and Road, where they're like, we need to open up new markets so we're not so reliant on these Western markets, which are beset by financial crises. And frankly, the Westerners will probably turn on us and get more protectionist somewhere down the line. Anyway, so you see all of that. You can document it with Chinese documents, and you can see the investment levels going up. And then the problem is, Lenin actually ironically warned about this. This is why he said capitalism would always lead to major power wars. He said the problem with capitalism is you run out of stuff to build at home. So you have to expand into foreign markets, which creates basically imperialism because then you got to build military power to protect all your far-flung assets. And then inevitably you start bumping up against the economic empires of other capitalist states, and it's going to lead to war. The great irony is that the Chinese Communist Party, I think, has fallen into this Lenin trap of our economy, our previous economic model is starting to run out of steam. We have to expand into new markets abroad and pump up our industries in order to sell into them. Then we got to build the military power to protect those. And then it creates this action reaction cycle that has really alarmed the Americans and many other countries around China. They react, and then China feels like it's an increasingly hostile world. I mean, I think that's the development we've been seeing certainly ever since 2008. And I felt it because I was a student, in the run up to the Beijing Olympics, and at that time I was still thinking of China as, yeah, it's clearly a brutal autocratic regime, but it feels like it's evolving towards this smarter form of authoritarianism, this much more technocratic state. But looking back, I actually think that was that was like sort of the beginning of the end because that massive shock set China on a course that has now led to much more geopolitical conflict with the West.
Yeah, there's no such thing as soft and cuddly authoritarianism, right?
That's another thing I've come to learn in my older age is, you can dress it up all you want, but at the end of the day, a dictator is going to dictate.
Yeah, it's almost as if Lenin was describing some other system besides capitalism that actually has these characteristics. But I wanted to ask you about, on that same note, the more aggressive stance. I believe you call it wolf warrior diplomacy, the sort of outward aggression in the messaging and the propaganda. That's another thing that I have noticed as someone who's followed this in recent years is just a more strident approach. They've got their spokespeople out there on Twitter, and in the U.S. context, we heard so much about Russian propaganda during the 2016 election and so forth, but not so much about Chinese propaganda. It's different. It's not quite as tapped into it seems like it's not quite as tapped into like the hot button social issues as what Russia was trying to inflame with their various bot farms and so forth. How would you describe the characteristics of Chinese propaganda?
Well, I think, if you're a communist Leninist dictator, you want to make the alternatives to your system look as shambolic and chaotic as possible. So a big part of it is just making sure to highlight all of the weaknesses and the hedonism in the West. So even things like homelessness, economic inequality, lack of infrastructure, obesity, just any sign that this is a corrupt and fundamentally chaotic system. And you can contrast that and say, look, we to the Chinese people, we may not give you all the civil and political rights and let you say whatever you want, but we have a different conception of human rights. We think the group matters more than the individual. If you just let everyone do whatever they want, you get chaos. And look at the West. But we have social harmony because we unite as a group. Sometimes you have to break eggs to make an omelet, and that's what we're doing. We also prioritize economic rights over civil and political rights. So yes, it might be great to let everyone say what they want and do what they want, but you're not going to build infrastructure. Look at the West. Look at California, where I'm from, trying to build high-speed rail, and it's still, we can go on all about that. And so yes, we're going to prioritize economic rights. So we're going to bulldoze peasant communities, but we're going to build high-speed rail in all these great cities. And at the end of the day, our system is not only going to enrich us domestically, but it's going to allow us to be strong internationally so that we never succumb to another century of humiliation in the future. I think that's the kind of messaging that they put out. And, from their perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense. And, again, I'm ultimately, I would bet on a open Western system. I'm a competition guy. I like competition in all spheres, economic competition. I like political competition. When you don't have it, people tend not to act right, at least in my opinion. I would bet on it in the long run, but I get it why they think, in the short run, it actually makes a lot more sense to unify and push forward. And so they're going to accentuate that.
I love the idea that, like, Chinese propagandists just think, like, Gavin Newsom is really bad, which is also a take that Zach and I frequently have. So, like, this is the one area where we actually totally agree, but possibly the only area.
I was going to say, we do our best to give the Chinese lots of ammunition with which to criticize our system. We seem to do that on a daily basis, unfortunately.
Yeah, although, and there does seem to be a lot of embracing of this idea that the U.S. does need to build all these big infrastructure projects that China has built. We need to do the high speed rail. We need to build the big have public investment in these same kind of things that they can achieve. Biden himself said China's like eating our lunch on all these projects, but there's never any discussion of just the debt trap that you described earlier. So I think that's something where our political discourse is just feeding into the Chinese propaganda narrative in a way that's not aligning with the facts. But to bring this to a close, I want to focus on peace and how we can actually avoid conflict with China. And I want to start by discussing the Trump administration, what looks like the Trump administration's China strategy, aside from tariffs. Nixon put a wedge between the Soviets and China by opening up relations with the latter. Trump, interestingly enough, seems to want to do the inverse of that, drawing Russia away from China, brokering, peace in Ukraine, and then, making peace with Putin, driving a wedge between Russia and China. Is that a viable strategy?
No, it's not a viable strategy. So the Nixon to China came more than a decade after the Sino-Soviet split. So the Soviets and the Chinese hated each other more than they hated the Americans at that point. And they even fought a small war in 1969 before Nixon even goes to Beijing. So the United States was knocking on an open door. It was also with a much weaker China that, once Deng Xiaoping comes into power, they see the benefits. I mean, they watch Japan and Taiwan and South Korea all get rich, joining Western markets. And so they said, yeah, let's do that too. And we can gang up on the Soviets and vote them off the island, and we'll deal with the Americans later. Well, that's where we are today. And the other point is, I think we in the United States assume that like all of the decisions that are happening in the Kremlin or in Zhongnanhai are revolving around what we do, as opposed to Vladimir Putin has his own goals for reconstituting, big parts of the former Russian Empire. I mean, he's been explicit about this in his statements. And so the idea that you can get him to just lay off Ukraine so that he can have this sort of quasi-alliance with the United States and totally blow off his romantic friend Xi Jinping and unite with the West that he has long been saying is hostile to Russia just seems a bridge too far. And I think you're already seeing, unfortunately, the lack of that option, given that Russia is still bombing Ukrainian cities, even after the U.S. tried to orchestrate this ceasefire, really on terms that seem to be highly favorable to Russia. So unfortunately, I don't think there's a reverse Kissinger in the cards. And as things get tougher for these two regimes, I mean, we saw this in World War II with the Axis powers. Like, it's not like they had a lot in common, the Japanese and the Nazis and the Italians, but they felt that they had to kind of hang together and support each other in a global confrontation against hostile powers. And that seems to be the mantra in both Beijing and Moscow at this point. That's unfortunately just the way it is.
So, if we could imagine a path to peace, a decade ahead where we are not coming into armed conflict with China, what does that look like? What would the US and China have to do differently than they are right now?
You know, we when we talk about the Cold War, we usually are talking about it in pejorative terms, like, "Oh, I can't believe we
Mhm.
had this Cold War. The Cold War is so stupid and so terrible and so costly." And it was all of those things. But in comparison to the alternatives, I think we should be giving credit to the leaders that somehow kept that conflict from going hot. It was not foreordained. And the more you read about the various crises that took place, including in the 80s, which most people don't even know about, how we almost died in a nuclear war, it's pretty incredible that both sides found ways to compete without actually escalating to direct clashes. Obviously, the proxy wars that killed millions of people around the globe were terrible, but better than World War III. I think in the US China case, I mean, what are the options? There's hot war, don't want that. There's capitulation, which, as we've talked about, unfortunately, I don't think offering up the Taiwanese as a sacrificial lamb to China is going to get it to stop. And then we'll just be
Mm.
dealing with the next crisis on much worse terms. And then there's Cold War, where you draw a line, you have strong deterrence, you unite with your allies, you re-globalize our economies, so we have a flourishing order among ourselves. You do have to do de-risking or decoupling or whatever with the Russians and the Chinese, and you basically, unfortunately, get these kind of blocks that form. But if they're sort of glaring at each other angrily, but not shooting directly at each other, if they're competing technologically and actually producing lots of like a space race dynamic that's producing all kinds of innovations that maybe help humans just in general down the line, and if they're competing for hearts and minds across the rest of the world and giving attention to areas that otherwise would be totally cut out and ignored, either from an aid or an investment or diplomatic perspective, I think a Cold War, it's terrible. You wouldn't want it, but given the alternatives, to me, that seems like the best way forward. And it's sort of like taking the old containment strategy from the Cold War, modifying it for a different type of adversary. But basically, it's the same mantra of we have faith in our system in the long run. We just need to make sure this doesn't escalate to a hot war in the short run. So let's set up some kind of containment infrastructure so that we can just let these two systems play out a peacetime competition. And hey, like whoever can compete economically in the long run, is going to come out on top. That would be the ideal. The only problem with that is the Chinese saw the end of the Cold War. And Xi Jinping, one of his jobs before becoming dictator was head of the Central Party School, where they teach the leaders how to lead. The top thing on the curriculum was how to prevent a Soviet-style collapse in China, how to prevent basically the Cold War from repeating in China's case. And it seems like the main lesson is to do the opposite of what Gorbachev did in bringing the Cold War to a peaceful end. So, like, he loosens up on the dissidents and the Soviet republics. We're going to put concentration camps in Xinjiang and crack down and build an Orwellian surveillance state. Gorbachev made nice with the West and signed arms control. We're going to have the biggest peacetime military buildup since Nazi Germany. So, unfortunately, I think the peaceful end of the Cold War, Cold War One, is going to make it more challenging for us to keep it cold.
Mm.
In this case, I still am relatively optimistic, but as the title of the book suggests, we're kidding ourselves if we think it's not going to
Yeah.
be conflictual.
But I mean, if the thesis of the book is in part that China is particularly dangerous right now because they're feeling like pushed into a corner, they're feeling like things are precarious, they're reaching their peak. Are there policies that the U.S. could be pursuing differently that doesn't push China further into that corner, or is this economic mess just one of their entirely of their own making?
Yeah, it's in the broad strokes, I would basically be doing the opposite of what we're doing. So what
Oh,
we're
yeah,
doing right now is
great.
coming out very economically hostile and very diplomatically hostile. So we're trying to choke out the Chinese economy. We're having all kinds of tough talk on things like Taiwan. Biden saying we will definitely defend, just changing the seeming US Taiwan policy. But we're dragging our feet on building up the military deterrent to prevent China. And so the Chinese are looking at us, I fear, in the same way that Imperial Japan looked at us, which is as economically and diplomatically hostile, but militarily vulnerable. And we saw how that played out, where they said, look, if we just punch them in the face, they'll just fold like a house of cards, and we'll just be able to, take over Taiwan in a fait accompli, and then their entire alliance system will shatter, and we'll emerge as the top power. I mean, that's the kind of logic that I worry could take hold. And I think the key point is it's not just China's economic slowdown and the problems that come from that. It's the combination of the previous rise that China had, which built up a lot of muscle, inflated the egos and the ambitions of Chinese leaders, but now combined with the confrontation and the economic slowdown. So it's the combination of sky-high ambitions with, hey, if we don't actually do something now, our long-term future could be bad. And that's why I just think leading with the outright economic hostility and being military vulnerable is the opposite of what we should do. We should have built up the military big stick, kept things quiet diplomatically, be as nice to them as possible in that respect. And then once we feel like we have a deterrent, then we can, renegotiate basically the economic bargain. But unfortunately, the time for that advice has sailed. And that's why I'm more in the circle the wagons kind of stage of planning to try to just avoid some kind of horrible, horrendous decision that I worry Xi Jinping might make in the next 5 or so years.
Yeah, to put it in really juvenile high school terms, it's sort of like you have to let the bully's words sort of, deflect off of you and not show that they're getting a rise out of you, but just hit the gym constantly and get those gains and get really swole so that they know that in the future they can't mess with you. And unfortunately, we seem to have foreclosed on a lot of options by taking a much more sort of like stupidly aggressive tack. Yeah, that this conversation gives me an awful lot to think about. I want to pose the final question of our show to you, which we ask all of our guests. And it is this: what is one question that you think more people should be asking?
I think people need to ask themselves what life looked like before the order that we've enjoyed. Because I think people assume that this is the norm. And as a child of the 90s, I also get that. I feel like I'm psychologically ill prepared for the kind of world that we're entering. But if you study history, you realize that's actually more the norm. So I wish people would ask themselves, hey, why is it that the number of countries in the world has like tripled since 1945? How did that happen? How is it that like a country like Singapore or South Korea or Saudi Arabia can seemingly just like plug and play with a global economy and it works, and I can use my credit card anywhere I go, and I can call home from phones all around the world and take a flight anywhere? Like, how did that actually happen? And what is the structure that is sustaining that? And in particular, what is the security foundation that enables that? I think Americans don't ask themselves enough about that. And that's why you're seeing the US basically just take the existing order for granted and go rogue. And I think the Chinese and the Russians just have elevated their own national aspirations above, they could have gone the like German and Japanese model or the French and British model, these proud great powers that have decided to no longer aggress against their neighbors and to focus on prosperity and their cultural achievements internationally. Unfortunately, the Chinese and the Russians, view their national greatness as the long-term thing. So I just wish more people around the world would just ask themselves questions so that they do not take this existing order for granted.
What a sobering thought that we have so very much to lose. Michael Beckley, thank you so much for talking to Reason.
Thank you. Wonderful conversation. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking Questions. If you want to support the show and help it grow, please like and share this episode. Leave a comment letting us know what you think. And if you have questions you'd like us to answer or any suggestions, you can email us at justaskingquestions@reason.com. See you next time.